168 men. That is all it took. 168 soldiers with steel swords, 13 muskets, and 12 horses stood at the edge of the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. An empire of 12 million people, vast mountain fortresses, and armies that had never known defeat. And in a single savage afternoon in 1532, they tore it apart forever. What you are about to hear is not just one of the most brutal turning points in history. It is the most audacious military gamble ever attempted in the entire story of the human race. If you love pulse-pounding military history like this, smash that like button right now and subscribe, because we are just getting started, and this story is going to shake you to your core. To understand what Francisco Pizarro walked into in 1532, you have to feel the full, staggering weight of the Inca Empire. Because without that weight, without that sense of impossible odds pressing down on every moment, the conquest of the Inca loses its power completely. The Inca called their empire Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters of the world. Their domain stretched from the burning deserts of northern Chile to the steaming jungles of modern-day Colombia, from the Pacific coast to the high peaks of the Andes. It spanned more than 2,000 miles from north to south. 12 million people, some historians say 16 million, lived under Inca rule, farming steep mountain terraces carved from living rock, building roads of stone that would endure for centuries, and worshipping the sun god Inti at temples sheathed in gold so bright they could blind a man at midday. The Inca had no wheel, no iron, no written language. And yet, in organizational complexity and imperial reach, Tawantinsuyu rivaled anything Rome had ever built. Their armies were massive. The Sapa Inca, the divine emperor, the living son of the sun, could call upon tens of thousands of warriors armed with clubs, slings, spears, and axes of hardened bronze. The Chimu, the Chanca, the Huanca, every rival civilization on the continent had fallen before them. Within living memory, no enemy had ever broken an Inca army in the open field. And into this empire walked Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro was no aristocrat. He was an illiterate swineherd from Extremadura in Spain, a man born without privilege, who had clawed his way upward through sheer ferocity. He had seen what Hernán Cortés had done to the Aztecs, how a handful of Spanish soldiers shattered the most powerful empire in Mexico with steel, gunpowder, and incomprehensible boldness. Pizarro intended to do the same. He recruited 168 men, veterans, gamblers, desperate men with nothing to lose. 106 were infantry, 62 rode horses. Together they carried 13 firearms, steel swords and lances, and armor forged in Spain. No reinforcements were coming. No retreat was planned. They sailed south with conquest in their hearts and gold burning like fever in their eyes. But something else worked in Pizarro. His favor. The Inca Empire was already dying. Years before Pizarro arrived, a catastrophic civil war had split the empire in two. The great Sapa Inca Huayna Capac had died, along with much of his court, in a devastating epidemic of smallpox that Spanish explorers had unknowingly seeded across the continent. That invisible killer raced along the very roads that made the empire great. His death left two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, fighting a savage war of succession that lasted 5 years and soaked the Andean soil in Inca blood. Atahualpa, commanding the hardened armies of the north, won that war only months before the Spaniards landed. He had crushed Huáscar, captured and imprisoned his own brother, massacred rival noble families. He stood at the absolute height of his power, and he made the worst decision of his life. He agreed to meet the strangers. The year was 1532. November, the mountain town of Cajamarca. Stone plazas and cold Andean wind, nestled in a valley 7,000 feet above sea level. Atahualpa camped nearby with an army that contemporary accounts placed at between 40,000 and 80,000 warriors. Every Spanish account agrees on one thing. The Inca force was overwhelming. It covered the hillsides like a human tide. Atahualpa was supremely confident. He was the son of the sun, the divine master of the known world, surrounded by tens of thousands of his finest soldiers. What could 168 foreigners possibly do to him? That confidence was the trap, and Pizarro had built it perfectly. The night before the meeting, Pizarro gathered his men in the stone buildings surrounding Cajamarca, the central plaza. Every man knew the plan. Every man knew what failure meant. No escape, no mercy, no second chance. Horses were muzzled to silence inside darkened buildings. Cannon were loaded and aimed at the open plaza. Swordsmen and gunners pressed flat against the walls, listening to their own ragged breathing. Outside, the campfires of Atahualpa's army glittered like a second sky. 10,000, 20,000 points of orange light in the cold Andean dark. Pizarro's men admitted to each other that night that they were terrified as they had never been before. One Spanish account recorded that many lost control of their bowels from pure animal fear. The sound of drums and chanting from the Inca camp rolled through the mountain air like a funeral drumbeat. But Pizarro did not waver. There was no going back. Every chip was on the table. The morning of November 16th of 1532 came cold and gray. Atahualpa dressed for the occasion with the full, blinding magnificence of imperial ceremony. A collar of enormous emeralds, a headdress blazing with gold and tropical feathers. His royal litter was carried by 80 lords in matching blue livery. Around him, his warriors filled the road and hillsides as far as any eye could see. But as the imperial procession entered the plaza of Cajamarca, something was wrong. The plaza was nearly empty. No ceremony, no kneeling servants, just a vast open square of stone and the cold wind moving through empty doorways. A single Spanish priest, Friar Vicente de Valverde, stepped from the shadows and walked toward the emperor, carrying a Bible and a cross. Through a terrified interpreter, he told the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere that he must submit to the Christian God and the sovereignty of the King of Spain. Atahualpa listened with a face of absolute stone. He had never seen a book before. He took it, turned it in his hands, and threw it to the ground. That was the signal. Pizarro, his trumpets screamed. The cannon opened fire with a sound like the world splitting open, a concussion so enormous in that enclosed stone space that birds burst from every rooftop. The Spanish cavalry exploded from every doorway simultaneously, horses at full gallop, steel lances leveled, riders firing pistols and roaring. The infantry poured out behind them with swords already swinging. The Inca had never faced anything like this. The cannon alone, the smoke, the thunder, the sudden death without visible cause, froze warriors in place with a terror that had no name in their experience. And then the horses, these enormous, impossibly fast creatures carrying armored men who turned on command and could not be stopped by a human body. The Inca warriors had no room to fight. They were packed so densely in that stone enclosure they could barely raise their arms. They could not form ranks. They could not flee. They could only die. They were not cowards. Every Spanish account is emphatic. These were battle-hardened soldiers who had never known defeat. But they had come to a ceremony, not a battle. Many carried only ceremonial weapons or none at all. The cavalry swept through them in circles of destruction, and the swords rose and fell without stopping. Pizarro himself drove directly toward Atahualpa's litter. His soldiers cut through the bearers one by one, and here was the moment that revealed something heartbreaking about the Inca world. As each lord who carried the sacred litter was killed, another stepped forward to take his place rather than allow the divine emperor to touch the ground. They kept stepping forward. They kept dying, until enough had fallen that the litter crashed onto the stones of the plaza. Pizarro seized Atahualpa by the arm. In that single act, the capture of the living son of the sun, the divine center around which the entire empire orbited, the largest civilization in the Western Hemisphere lost its reason to function. Outside the plaza, the Inca army could have overwhelmed the Spanish in minutes. They outnumbered them by hundreds to one. But the capture of the Sapa Inca was a spiritual catastrophe so total it paralyzed every warrior who witnessed it. The Inca military was built around the absolute divine will of the emperor. Without him, without his voice, his authority, the living God on his golden throne, the army had no orders and no legitimacy. Tens of thousands of warriors scattered into the hills. By nightfall, 168 Spaniards held the emperor of the world. Atahualpa, imprisoned but possessed of a sharp and calculating mind, quickly understood what the strangers wanted above all else. He made them an offer that has echoed through history as one of the most stunning ransom proposals ever recorded. He would fill the room in which he was held, approximately 17 feet long and 22 feet wide, with gold as high as a tall man could reach. Then 2 smaller rooms with silver, all of it in exchange for his freedom. Pizarro accepted. Over the following months, llama caravans and long lines of bearers made their way to Cajamarca from every corner of the empire. Gold was stripped from temple walls. Sacred objects representing centuries of Inca artistry were melted into featureless bars. Spanish soldiers watched in stunned disbelief as the room slowly, impossibly filled. The final tally, approximately 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver, was a fortune beyond the imagination of most European kings. The rooms were filled, the ransom was paid, and Pizarro broke his word. Rather than release Atahualpa, the Spanish staged a trial, a legal farce conducted in a language the defendant did not speak, by men who had already decided the verdict. Convicted of fratricide, idolatry, and plotting rebellion, he was sentenced to death by burning. When he accepted Christian baptism at the last moment, the sentence was commuted to garroting. On August 29th of 1533, the son of the sun was strangled in the plaza of Cajamarca while his captors watched. The killing of Atahualpa fractured the empire into desperate fragments. Pizarro marched south toward Cusco, a city of 100,000 people, its walls faced with hammered gold. Cusco fell in November of 1533. The great temple of the sun, Corijancha, was stripped of its gold plating. The sacred garden of the sun, with its golden replicas of corn, llamas, and butterflies, was emptied and melted into bars. But the conquest was far from over. In 1536, Manco Inca, a noble whom the Spanish had installed as a puppet emperor, rose in a revolt that shook the entire colonial enterprise. He raised an army of 100,000 warriors and besieged Cusco, using fire arrows to burn Spanish-held buildings, filling the streets with suffocating smoke. His forces were organized, adapted, and ferocious. This was not the paralyzed army of Cajamarca. This was disciplined adaptation and burning, vengeful intelligence. The siege lasted nearly a year. The fighting was intimate and savage, street by street, rooftop by rooftop, doorway by doorway. The Spanish garrison of fewer than 200 soldiers held the city against overwhelming force. The climax came at the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman above the city, where Spanish cavalry and Inca warriors fought hand-to-hand across massive stone terraces while Cusco burned below in smoky Andean air. The siege came agonizingly close to succeeding. Ultimately it failed. Spanish reinforcements arrived, and Manco's coalition fractured under hunger and disease. But Manco Inca did not surrender. He never surrendered. He retreated east into the remote jungle of Vilcabamba, beyond the last Andean passes, into the steaming green immensity of the Amazon basin, and established what historians call the Neo-Inca state. In that unconquerable wilderness, the memory and structure of Tawantinsuyu survived for nearly 4 more decades. Manco launched raids against Spanish settlements, sheltered thousands of refugees, and kept alive the idea that the empire was not dead, only waiting. He was killed in 1544, stabbed by Spanish fugitives he had sheltered, treachery repaid with treachery. His sons continued the resistance until 1572, when Viceroy Francisco de Toledo drove an overwhelming expedition into Vilcabamba. The jungle city fell. The last Sapa Inca, Tupac Amaru, was captured near the Urubamba River and brought back to Cusco in chains. He was baptized, and on September 24th of 1572, in the central plaza of the city that had once been the navel of the world, before tens of thousands standing in absolute silence, Tupac Amaru was publicly beheaded. When the head was lifted and held before the crowd, a sound rose from tens of thousands of throats. Not a battle cry, not a cheer, but something deeper and more terrible than either. A sound that one Spanish witness described, with evident discomfort, as the sky itself weeping. The fall of the Inca Empire was one of the most decisive turning points in all of human history. A rupture so complete that it reshaped the fate of an entire hemisphere for centuries to come. From Cajamarca in 1532 to the Plaza of Cusco in 1572, the conquest lasted 40 years. 4 decades of warfare, treachery, epidemic, and cultural devastation that reduced a population of 12 million to fewer than 1 million within a century. The silver mines of Potosi, worked by forced indigenous labor in conditions of almost unimaginable horror, would pour wealth into Spain for the next 250 years. The Spanish did not win because they were braver or more deserving. They won because smallpox killed millions before a single sword was drawn, because civil war had fractured the empire, its political will, and because horses, steel, and gunpowder were technologies the Inca had no time to answer. And they won because of the cold, calculating audacity of men who staked everything on one irreversible gamble and refused to flinch. But the Inca did not simply vanish. Their descendants are still there, in the markets of Cusco, in high Andean villages, in festivals where ancient ceremonies survive beneath a thin coating of Catholic imagery. The roads they built are still walked. The terraces they carved from living rock still hold their soil. And Machu Picchu still stands above the clouds, silent and unconquered by time, a monument to what was lost and what endures. This is the thought that should stay with you. 168 desperate men walked into the greatest empire in the Western Hemisphere, and through some terrible convergence of invisible plague, political fracture, and sheer audacity, they brought it down. History does not always belong to the largest army. Sometimes it belongs to the most desperate gamble, and to the terrible luck of standing on the right side of a biological war that no one even knew was being fought. The Inca Empire is gone, but the story of how it died will never stop being one of the most astonishing, heartbreaking, and unforgettable events in the entire human record. If that story gave you chills, if the image of 168 men standing in the dark before 40,000 enemy campfires made your blood run cold, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. Subscribe so you never miss another story like this one, because there are dozens more battles, last stands, and turning points of history waiting for you here. And leave a comment. I read every single one. Here's your question for today. If Atahualpa had ordered his army to attack the moment the trap became clear, could the Inca have destroyed Pizarro's force and changed the entire history of the Americas? Tell me what you think in the comments below.